Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kate Wild, and I'm HDR UK Scotland's co-director alongside Professor David Robertson. So welcome to our webinar with CSO. I'm just going to briefly introduce the agenda and then we'll switch over to our speakers. So just a reminder, as you will have seen in the chat, this meeting is being recorded. The slides and the link to the recording will be shared with the participants after the webinar. And following the presentations, there will be an opportunity for question and answers with the speakers. Today, we're going to have three presentations around 10 to 15 minutes each. We've got Professor David Lowe, who's the clinical lead for innovation, and he's going to provide a short introduction covering the CSO Innovation overview. We've then got Carrie Thompson, that's in for Sean Anderson. So Carrie is the Programme Lead for Innovation Collaboration and will give us a short overview of the Chief Scientist's Office and the CSO Innovation Fellowship Programme. And then finally, we've got Chris Sainsbury, who is an Innovation Fellow, and he's going to discuss his current research. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David, who will kick us off. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the invite to speak today. I'm just assuming everybody can hear me. If a thumbs up from somebody, that'd be great. Perfect. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. My name is David Lowe. I'm Professor of Health Innovation for the University of Glasgow, and I'm fortunate to have a similar role within Scottish Government and the Chief Scientist's Office. What I'm going to do today is very broadly lay out the CSO innovation strategy in terms of our delivery mechanism, which is predominantly through the regional innovation hubs. And then I'll pass on to Carrie, which is going to talk a little bit about the fellowship programme. And then Chris, who is one of our most excellent fellows, is going to talk about some of the work he's doing, particularly around about data. And I'm very fortunate to collaborate with Chris around about that piece of work. So hopefully slides will move easily. So I suppose the disclaimers I've already alluded to is I have a number of roles. I'm an emergency medic within Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And we'll be going off to a shift there later. And therefore, some of the comments and I suppose my expertise is particularly around about unscheduled care, and therefore I'll kind of situate it within that as well. So I think it's important to recognise the challenges we're currently in, and if any of the members on the call have not read, or at least a summary of the recent Darcy report around about the performance of the NHS, I would absolutely recommend it, because ultimately, quite a lot of the activity, the funding from Office of Life Science and otherwise, is really going to be focused on responding to some of the challenges that Lord Darcy set out, recognising the exponential challenges that we face within the NHS now need exponential solutions, and therefore the use of data to be able to respond to that, with AI being my particular area of interest in decision support, is really one of those potential exponential solutions that can be applied, and therefore the CSO, in conjunction with Scottish Government, UK Government, are really focused on how do we essentially stimulate both industry and academic partners to be able to utilise data to be able to respond to some of these challenges that we currently have. And I'm very glad to say that actually Neil Gray, our Health Minister, got ahead of Lord Darcy in terms of being able to say that innovation is absolutely critical to our NHS reform, and those reforms must be accelerated through the transformational potential of scientific innovation. That's very much where the CSO sits within government, is how do we support researchers producing great research that can be translated into improving the health of our nation, recognising that life science remains one of the kind of key areas of economic growth within Scotland, and it's how do we attract both industry to work with us, but also for our academics, our higher education institutes to be engaged in that process, because ultimately sustainable delivery of healthcare is going to require everybody to work really hard together, recognising we simply can't ask NHS colleagues just to work harder and faster. But I think what we very much believe within NHS Scotland and the CSO is really focused on is that we actually have the opportunity to be able to deliver healthcare innovation at scale and at pace, recognising that some of the challenges that we face within the Scottish healthcare system, the UK healthcare system, is similar to those that are being faced worldwide. And again, recognising we've got specific opportunities around about some of the key investments in infrastructure, so things like regional safe havens that mirror out data from the healthcare system, to be able to provide that into trusted research environments, to be able to ask some of these really tricky questions around about who's at risk within our population and how do we develop solutions, be it AI interpretation of chest x-rays for lung cancer, all the way through to predicting those that are most likely to come back into the emergency department, and therefore how can we seek to be able to transfer their care in a different way. And what Dame Anna, my boss, the Chief Science Officer, is very keen on, and I agree with her, is around about that porosity. And webinars like this are a really great example of how do we create a shared language, but also a shared understanding of the challenges and therefore the opportunity to respond. And that triple helix that we have between the NHS, the healthcare system, academia, and industry is how do we squeeze as much value out of that as possible, recognising the challenges we have both fiscally as well as in terms of delivery really do need us to work more effectively together. And I would argue that data is very much the conduit for us to be able to do that. So within the CSO, we've very much thought about this idea around about open innovation, which is being able to describe the challenges around about healthcare delivery, and then really to be able to engage with industry, the NHS and academia to do that. Recognising that success often looks like solutions that are being driven into the NHS, but equally can go to external markets and other healthcare systems. And the regional innovation hubs are really the conduit substrate for us to be able to do that by being able to provide expertise, clinical as well as program management data to be able to pull through those ideas, to engage and to be able to start to develop solutions. And really what we're looking for is to be able to create evidence support the change in paradigm of care. If you think about the NHS, it's still in a lot of ways predicated on the 1950s models of care, which were looking after people at the later phases of disease. And what Darcy and Scottish Government have very clearly said is we need to move towards the left into the community, which is challenging, but more focus more on proactive and preventative care. But we need to evidence that in terms of its clinical effectiveness, its cost effectiveness, its acceptability, both to the healthcare workers that may be going to change the delivery of care mode, but also critically to those patients that we're going to be serving. And then finally, the technical performance of these devices, these solutions, as we move forward. So the CSO has really put together the regional innovation hubs to respond to that. So it's really be able to think about how do we provide that expertise to understand the problem, to be able to do that initial feasibility work, into pilot, then into test of change, and then adoption, which I'll touch on later, which is again, how do we create the evidence to be able to support the decision making to adopt a technology solution at scale that's going to make a market difference within the healthcare system it is. And we've got 3 hubs in place that look after the 13 territorial boards within Scotland. And that's really a way of centralising some of that effort, but equally centralising the expertise to really be able to engage around about how do you access data from the regional safe haven, where do you put it in terms of a trusted research environment. And we're increasingly doing really these sort of projects at scale, so things like TBI Reporter, so Traumatic Brain Injury Reporter, that's led by Glasgow and Cambridge, but that data is flowing into HDR UK, leveraging some of the expertise that they previously had around about the Dementia Hub, and now we're mirroring that process of taking data across the UK and making it available to solve some of the problems we have in that context around about traumatic brain injury and concussion. Carrie's going to talk a little bit about the fellowship opportunity, and we've had a series of catalyst programs really around about defining a problem or challenge and bringing industry and academia to bear to be able to, again, to evidence that. And we've used a number of partners to do that through Office of Life Science, NIHR, as well as CivTech, which is another function within Scottish Government. And some of these national innovation challenges will be no surprise to anybody on this call, recognising these are some of the really significant problems we have, but equally the opportunities to be able to again provide evidence to change that paradigm of care. So things like mental health, we're seeing huge upsurge in mental health requirements, and how do we support that, recognising there's a number of pinch points or bottlenecks that potentially technologies can help serve those patients better. And each of these programs is usually supported by one of the hubs in terms of coordination, access to data, and obviously clinical expertise. And Chris is going to talk about a couple of his pieces of work within the areas of diabetes shortly. And I think it's really important, again, to highlight that really what we're trying to do is create a pipeline of recognising there'll be a lot of activity in that early phase funnel of ideation, and maybe be able to validate solutions, but we do want to have that golden thread of solution services that are going to be pulled through into the NHS that we can actually say are markedly making a difference in terms of patients' lives. And in terms of that final piece of being the pull through, Dame Anna set up the Innovation Design Authority, which is really a mechanism to be able to take innovations that are sitting within the hubs, but equally horizon scan into the wider UK worldwide markets, and identify those proven innovations that can transform how we deliver healthcare, and really orchestrating a number of different agencies that sit within NHS Scotland in an effective, streamlined way to then be able to deliver into the territorial boards at pace, recognising that if we unpick those particular challenges around about adoption effectively, then we can really do that and transform how we adopt innovation at scale. And I think finally, we have to recognise that solutions to adoption are not exponential and do need a lot of hard work. It's investing in leadership, which is some of the fellowship programme that Carrie's going to talk about, coordination through the hubs, how we work with the higher education institutes around evidence generation by activating health economics or clinical trials units, and have a really consistent understanding of the clinical pathways and not just about dropping technologies in. But then equally recognising within Scotland, we've got a huge opportunity around about CAI, or regional safe havens, and actually a fairly consolidated set of platforms, such as our PACS and risk system for radiology, that allows us to deliver solutions at scale across the territorial boards, rather than just individually going to each one, trying to knock over some of those problems. And then finally, we are constrained around about our fiscal situation at the moment. So therefore, how do we take a portfolio approach and leverage both our industry partners, but equally recognise that there's an opportunity to be able to scale one technology and another? And if you think about the lung cancer pathway, we may do some work around about chest X-ray, that then we'll build into nodule management, CT, and then might move into a precision medicine approach to guiding therapeutic decisions. So I think that really leaves me in the final point, that is really about reducing duplication, streamlining the assets that we have, and recognising that each of those bodies that we described has some core functions, and how do we engage with both academic and industry colleagues to really respond to some of those quite challenging healthcare problems that we have, that I'm no doubt going to experience this evening on a Monday in a Government Emeritus Department. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. Very happy to obviously signpost to the regional innovation hubs to engage in any particularly problems you wish to solve or solutions you wish to validate, and I'll pass on to Carrie, that's going to talk around about the fellowship programme. So thank you.
Thanks, David. I think you're going to bring up the slides for me, is that right? Sorry, I'm a bit croaky as well. And also, as Katie touched on there, I'm not Sean Anderson, as it says here. He has been pulled away to support the Chief Scientist for Health, Professor Dame Anna Dominicek, but he does owe me a LEMSIP, so I'm not on my finest form today. So I'm the Programme Lead for Innovation Collaboration within the Chief Scientist Office Innovation Team. And my role really involves the management of the innovation portfolio. David's touched on a number of the elements of it there, but really we're the kind of key working with the Innovation Hub. Innovation hubs, there's 3 across the regions, funded by the Chief Scientist Office to manage and deliver open innovation competitions, and also run the NHS Scotland Innovation Fellowship Scheme, which I'll talk more about in a moment. So this work is with stakeholders across academia, industry, and the NHS, and it aims to simplify what's quite a complex landscape, to provide recommendations and advice to industry and the people that we work with, but also that position within Scottish Government to provide those recommendations and advice to ministers and support all of this effort across Scotland. So a quick run through of the Chief Scientist Office, and then I'll talk a little bit about the fellows. So next slide, please. The Chief Scientist Office sits in the Health and Social Care Directorate of the Scottish Government. The primary focus here is to fund and support research and innovation, and that's around improving the health of the people of Scotland and the services provided by Scotland. So the CSO plays like a pivotal role in advancing research, development and innovation across health in Scotland. So we have quite a well-established research programme across NHS Scotland, including the fellowship portfolio run by CSO is wider than the innovation ones that I'll touch on. And I'll put a link into the chat in a minute when I'm not multitasking to cover all of the fellowships that we do. Beyond this, we also fund multiple research units. We govern the safe havens for data research. We have those 3 regional innovation hubs, and we ensure that Scotland's participation in the UK and EU research programmes, such as the I4I NIHR programme, which has recently become available to everybody in Scotland. So in recent years, the CSO responsibilities have been expanded to include the innovation and adoption portfolio that David just ran through there. Further driving innovation into health services across the country. So this is really a developing portfolio for CSO, but a lot of work going on at the moment. So you'll see within, sorry, next slide, please. You'll see within this is the organogram for CSO, and it just outlines the organizational structure. So the CSO is led by Ewan Dick, and with Professor Dame Anna Dominicek, she's the Chief Scientist for Health. So together they provide that strategic direction for the office, supported by the business team. Here we've got also the key characters in the Chief Scientist Office. And I think on my next slide, I've got, we'll stay on this one for the minute, but on the next slide, there's an email address. And really, if there's any questions around any of these portfolios, you can come straight through to the CSO on these. So my colleague, Dr. Barlow, oversees areas including population health, health services, health data, science research, and aspects of NRS, which is the NHS Research Scotland. Dr. McNear is responsible for research funding, research infrastructure support, and UK-wide collaborations. Mr. Toft heads up the research infrastructure, governance, and ethics team, ensuring that our research activities are well regulated and ethical. And Dr. Weller leads the NHS Research Scotland Central Management Team, coordinating the research efforts across NHS Scotland. Again, I'll put some links in on these in a minute. And then we get to my team, which is led by David Thompson. So he was previously responsible just for that adoption arm of the work that David was just touching on there. So we support a lot of work in the team around innovation development, but also then look at that adoption and national decision making to move and support some of these ideas from early stage innovation into the actual NHS. So David was originally responsible for that adoption side of the team, and now has temporary responsibilities to include all of the innovation work, and rightly is having a week off to get himself strong for managing that responsibility. So this team, between us all, provides the national guidance and coordination for innovation activities across NHS Scotland. So we have quite a number of those vital roles across that strategic direction for health, research, development and innovation. And we're also the primary public funders for NHS Scotland's research infrastructure. And finally, we bring together the NHS boards, academic institutions and the life sciences sector to position Scotland as a global leader in health and research innovation, and really make use of the benefits of our more simple NHS structure to be able to develop innovative ideas. Next slide, please. So here we've got a list, I'm afraid, of the CSO priority areas, and I'll just touch on a couple of them. We've also got the email address there at the bottom, and really any inquiry that you have, please do ask questions in this session, but do get in touch with us via this email address as well. So for the Once for Scotland approach, this aims to streamline research efforts across the entire country. So it's really about ensuring Scotland remains compatible with UK-wide initiatives like the UK Research Recovery and Resilience Programme, but it allows for that efficient setup and delivery of research projects across Scotland. Data accessibility is one of the other key focuses. So we're working really closely with data and digital colleagues to ensure secure and accessible data for research and innovation, with the safe havens providing that crucial role. So we encourage the collaborations between health boards and safe havens to improve the data availability. In terms of talent development, the CSO is committed to maintaining its fellowship offerings and ensuring that clear pathway for health professionals to develop their RD&I skills. We support within that the collaboration, and Chris will probably touch on this next, that collaboration within this between the NHS, academia and industry, which has an essential role in expanding the fellowship opportunities. We also maintain Scotland's national platform for health RD&I, are continuously working with NHS Research Scotland to modernise it and embed research into primary and secondary care. And finally, we support the community in attracting investment into Scotland. So with a focus on creating that end-to-end pathway that David presented there, from early stage into adoption for the research, development and innovation that leads to the national implementation of new treatments and services. Next slide, please. So this briefly describes the Innovation Fellowship Scheme. So launched in 2022, it's a key part of our efforts to foster that culture of innovation within NHS Scotland. The scheme supports NHS staff in developing innovation careers alongside their clinical ones, and it has two distinct strands. So the first is the Innovation Fellowship for senior clinical staff, providing protected time to lead the development of innovation projects. And the second is the Innovation Academic Fellowship, similar names, ever confusing. This one's for early stage innovators who are fully funded to pursue higher degrees. So the programme is designed to build capacity for leadership in research, development and innovation within NHS Scotland. The fellows work collaboratively with partners to develop a product, a service or a device with that overarching goal of transforming the way that health and social care services are delivered. The first cohort of the NHS Scotland Innovation Fellowships is nearing completion, and we're currently running an in-depth evaluation of their performance. This includes not only immediate progress, but long-term impacts of their innovation. And it would be great if we could do some kind of showcase event to share what has been achieved through these, and any details we'll be able to share via this network as well. And in addition, our second cohort of the CSO Innovation Academic Fellowships is progressing well, with another cohort commencing this year. So we've not at the moment launched the next round of the fellowship programme, as we're taking time to review it and review its progress, and delivery model. But we'll ensure that any future fellowships continue to align with the needs and demands of NHS Scotland, and we'd be happy to share any information when available via this group. That's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, I shall share my screen. How is it? Is it?
So we can, yep, that's perfect. Now we've got a few black squares. That's
yes, just getting rid of those. Those are the Zoom controls, which I think show up as black boxes. There we go. So I think the one in that should be as good as it's going to get, I think.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Chris.
Excellent. So thanks very much, and thanks for asking me to speak as well. So I am one of the, I think, the first cohort of Innovation Fellows. I'm just sort of coming to the end of my 2 years now, and so I'm a diabetologist, primarily based at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and also in Gartnavel. And I also have academic interests within Glasgow and Birmingham. And what I didn't put on this slide is that I also work with a University of Dundee and NHS Scotland spin-out, My Way Digital Health, on this same sort of work. So data and machine learning in diabetes, so sort of bridging the industry gap. There, I'll see if I can get there we go. So just in the next 15 minutes or so, I was going to talk a little bit about the fellowship and the benefits that I've had from that. And then I've picked two similar related projects from the projects that I've got going on at the moment, which are looking at essentially ways of generating synthetic data and using that data to perform virtual target trial emulation. And I'll explain why we might want to do that as we go. The methods are both machine learning based methods, and that's my area of interest. These particular ones are both neural network based, and those are good examples of the types of methods that I'm using, although I've got lots of other projects looking at things like transformers and large language models, etc. As well. But these two are related and sort of fit together nicely. And then lastly, I'll just show you some of the results and talk about what I might do going forwards. So in this last couple of years from the Innovation Fellowship, obviously, as David was saying, we've got the local innovation hubs, and it's very useful to be part of that setup from my perspective, particularly when you're doing collaboration agreements and just getting through the process. It's very useful to have support, project managers, etc., helping with the various projects. And we've also had regular meetings and interaction with other fellows on the program and related programs. And I think that's been very valuable. And from my perspective, it's led to some additional grants coming in, which are developments of the projects that I was working on going into the fellowship. So it's been a productive time, and the two sessions that I have during the fellowship are being continued on locally. So it's given me a good springboard to continue with protected time for development of these ideas. So I'm just going to touch on synthetic data. There's a huge list here of potential benefits of synthetic data. And there's quite a few groups developing synthetic data sets in various different ways across Scotland and wider. From my point of view, the top two benefits there are the sort of main focus from my perspective. So data augmentation is a big potential benefit for me because often we're developing predictive models or machine learning type models within data sets where you have an imbalance of classes, which poses significant methodological problems. And if we had a method of expanding up those classes to allow easier application of our methods whilst retaining the validity of the data, then that would be hugely useful. And in particularly, it's useful potentially useful for rare conditions. So in diabetes, that's things like genetic diabetes, MODY. But all of these methods, I'm working within the field of diabetes just because that's my area, and we do have a very good diabetes data set in Scotland, but they're all applicable across the domain, any domain where we have clinical data available. And then, of course, I've got privacy preservation, which I think is most people's main motive for generating synthetic data, because we all know how difficult it is to access data, to get collaborators access to your clinical data and for you to get into their data. And if we could have a method of sharing data without the risk of disclosure of information, then that would be hugely useful. And then the other big concept that I want to try and present here is target trial emulation, and then I'll show you how they fit together. So trial emulation is an emerging method spearheaded by Miguel Hernan from Harvard. And it's really sort of gaining credibility, and you'll see more and more papers, I think, demonstrating trial emulations in the coming years. There's lots of potential reasons why you might want to do a target trial emulation. And what an emulation is just taking a randomized controlled trial in its simplest form, taking a randomized controlled trial that has already been done in a known population, and then going back into your own routinely collected data, so real world data sets, applying the same inclusion and exclusion criteria, extracting the population who fit those criteria, and then seeing if they show the same or a different effect size of a medication or any form of intervention as was seen in the randomized controlled trial. So there's lots of reasons why, again, there's a huge list here of potential reasons why it might be useful. But for me, this is the main reason why trial emulation is potentially a hugely useful tool, especially in the cardiovascular and diabetes domain. So what I've tried to represent here is the two populations of people that you need to think about when you're deciding to give a medication to someone. On the left, you've got the red, small, randomized controlled trial population. So this is a group of people who've been very tightly phenotyped. They're within a particular age. They're only on 1 or 2 drugs. Anyone with other conditions, comorbidities, is likely to have been excluded. And so you've got a very precisely characterized group of people who unfortunately don't really look very much like a lot of the people that you see in the real world. So most of our real world population obviously are people of any age with many other conditions who are taking many other medications. And we generalize the results of the RCT population across into what I would call the RCD population, which is a routinely collected data population. So this is the real world individuals we see at clinic. But in actuality, only a small number of people in the real world population are the same as the people in the trials. So it's probably not 100% valid always to take that information and apply it to the people we see in clinic. So if we can take our routinely collected data and test the hypothesis that these drugs perform in the same way, using a trial emulation approach, which, as far as possible, manages the potential forms or the potential sources of bias, then we could ask the question as to whether we really do see the same effect. Is it valid to treat these people as if they were in a trial, or is it not? And of course, we can run these trials across people with multiple conditions without really worrying too much about the availability of people to go into trials, because we're using routinely collected data. So we've got a much wider range of people that we could test these drug effects on. So that's my main motive for performing target trial emulation in the diabetes population. So I'm just now going to present a couple of methods that we use to try and do this. And in the process, we generate synthetic data. So we're generating synthetic data, and we're also doing this trial emulation basically simultaneously in both of these projects. So the first is the Generalized Adversarial Network, or GANs. So this was first described in 2014. So it's a relatively old method in machine learning. It was very, very hot for a few years and has recently been knocked off its perch by LLMs and transformers, etc. But it's still a very useful method. And the very interesting thing about this method is that it takes 2 neural networks and it pits them against each other. So on the left, you've got a neural network, which is called the generator, which comes up with an example of the data you're trying to produce. So for us, that would be tabular data. And on the right, you've got a discriminator network, which looks at that output from the generator, and it tries to make a decision as to whether that data is a real example of data or is it a fake example of data. And this discriminator also has access to real data, so it kind of knows what real data looks like. When the discriminator sees a fake data sample, it sends some information back to the generator. So it gives some information about how far away from real that data is. And that's the core concept in neural networks, this loop of feedback. And if you go around that loop enough times, the generator understands what it needs to do to produce data that the discriminator thinks is real. So once you've trained this fully, which is a difficult process, ultimately you have a generator that can produce fake data which the discriminator can't tell from real data. So in essence, you're producing examples of real data from the same class. Now, this technique was devised for images. And at the top, these are images generated by the NVIDIA style GAN, which is probably the most advanced version of GANs that were produced for images. And we have a particular problem with our sort of clinical data, because if you look at the images, it's very easy to say, is that good data or is it bad data? Because the far left image is clearly not good and the others are clearly quite good. That's very easy to say. But if you look at the tabular data, it's very hard to say, is this high quality data or is it not? Are the distributions right? Are the interactions right? Very difficult to tell. So one way to tell, of course, is to try and dig into that data and see if it tells you things which look realistic. And this is where target trial emulation can help us. So we can take our real data and perform an emulation. We can take our generated data and perform an emulation. And if both emulations give us similar results, then we say we think the data we're producing has got useful information within it. But we can go further than that, because the generator, in order to generate realistic samples of data which pass as real, has to have a good understanding of what the data is constructed with, of what are the interactions, what are the distributions. It knows everything about that data. So you can actually go into the generator and directly extract that information, and you can represent it in this type of way as a diagram, which essentially is the model's best guess at what features influence what other features within the model. So we've got confounders, we've got treatments, and we've got outcomes. And you can make these quite complex, these DAGs, these causal diagrams. And that's a very interesting sort of byproduct of this type of method, is that you can extract the model's understanding of the data as well as using it to generate synthetic data. I'll skip over some of these graphs. So that's method one. The second method is a variational autoencoder, which I think was first described in 2013. So again, slightly older neural network method, but super powerful and very useful. And this takes a different approach to generating synthetic data. Here you've got a pair of neural networks, one which takes your original data and compresses it down to some low-dimensional representation. And then on the other side, you've got another network which essentially reinflates that data back up to the original reconstructed, or the original data, only a reconstruction of that original data. And in training this model, essentially you take the reconstruction on the right and you compare it with the input on the left, and then you tweak the networks until they look basically the same. So again, this is an image example. What we're doing is taking the same idea, but applying it to tabular data again. So we can take our 180 columns worth of data on the left, compress it down to 32 dimensions or 32 columns. So there'll be 32 columns of numbers between 0 and 1, but the decoder network is trained to be able to take those 32 numbers and reinflate them back up to a realistic set of 180 numbers, which are gradients in HbA1c, their BMI, their blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. So they're useful in information-rich data sets that it's extracting from this low-dimensional representation. And again, we can do that fairly well with enough training and show that our synthetic and real data looks good. But the key thing is that we can do this additional trick of conditional generation, where we can specify the type of data we want the decoder to generate. You can say you want people with type 1 diabetes, people on metformin, people on GLP-1 agonists, for example. But crucially there, if we condition the VAE to produce populations of people who look like the two arms of a trial, so one population of people who are on metformin plus a non-active placebo type drug, and one arm on metformin plus something like gliclazide, a glucose lowering drug, we can then get it to produce a arbitrarily large population of people who are both arms of a trial. And in doing that, we've then generated our trial emulation, and we can do that in any combination of features that we want to describe. And this is incredibly useful and potentially very powerful, I think. So we're just at the stage now of fine-tuning the conditional generation to allow us to directly do these sort of one-shot virtual trial emulations. So that's the end of my slides. I mean, I think the main thing from my work is that all of this is done in diabetes. There's lots of very powerful methods here to use in data, but it can be used in any data set. And obviously within the safe havens around the country, we've got lots of data on lots of people, and we can potentially apply these methods as we need to any subset of that data, which is of interest to people in particular clinical domains. And that's the end.
Thank you very much.
Try and work out how to unshare my screen. Hang on. There we go.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much to all three speakers. Hopefully those on the call have found it really useful. There's a couple of questions in the chat already. So I'm going to ask Elaine first if she wants to come on and ask her question directly. Otherwise, I can ask it on her behalf. Ask it on behalf of, yeah, I'll ask it. So this is to all speakers, so you're all up. Can you share your insights and challenges around the workforce planning and design implications of innovation? David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that probably sits naturally with me. Yes, it's a really great question. I think the first thing to say is the regional innovation hubs work in a cost recovery model, which means that there's quite a lot of scoping activity that goes on at the start to be able to understand what the proposed innovation is, and therefore how are we going to evidence it, and how we bring out and coordinate all those parties together. I think the second piece is the design implications component, which can be, I think ultimately it's critical, is being able to describe what the current pathway of care is, get people that actually do the job. So there's no point asking me as a professor of emergency medicine what happens at 2 o'clock in the morning in an ED. I have no idea, frankly. So therefore it's making sure that you actually bring the right people in to actually describe how they deliver care as currently imagined, and then be able to unpick the opportunities for innovating around about that pathway. And that sometimes requires to understand the specific bottlenecks, and equally where the opportunities are to be able to think about a technology, a solution, a service that will impact into that, recognizing that often there might be quite significant downstream impact for that. So if you take chest X-ray eye, which has just published a protocol paper, so it's high in my head at the moment, there's obviously potential for false positives, and therefore radiologists have to read more X-rays. The AI may bias that reporting, so there may be more CT requirements, but ultimately, as an AI flags a potential X-ray as lung cancer, you have this compaction of CT requests into a short period of time. So there's a real requirement to understand how that technology can be most effectively placed, but that really has to then describe the cost of clinical effectiveness that often has both downstream and upstream impacts. And I think the final things to say is that increasingly we're looking at how we can activate and engage the workforce to do things differently. So some of the work that Chris and I are involved in is really thinking about how we can use community pharmacists. So we're going to have a data-driven approach to identifying those patients with significant cardiometabolic and renal risk. How do we then activate community practice pharmacists to be able to optimize their therapy, recognizing there's good evidence that if you put them on guideline-based therapy, you reduce hospitalizations and downstream costs. So I think there is a pause point, Elaine, when you start to think about deploying a technology that really is describing current pathway, what the future pathway may look like, and then bringing all those stakeholders in to be able to understand what the potential implications are And again, this was finally recognising you never get this quite right. And that's why you have to bring the team along with you, as per any research or innovation project, because there will be some inevitable bumps in the road, no matter how well you scope things out. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you. Chris, Carrie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I'll go. Just to follow up on what David was saying there, that there's a couple of ways that we would consider the workforce within this work and this portfolio, in terms of the fellowship scheme, as I was mentioning before in the presentation, around that supporting people who are working within the NHS to be able to undertake innovation projects as part of their clinical time. And if we're that development opportunity is embedded within the systems, then it already has that kind of hook into the impact that the project can have, but also bringing that kind of workforce element into the design as well. And the second really is around that portfolio of projects that David was presenting on earlier. We've supported in the Chief Scientist Office a number of open innovation projects to up to the value of about £9 million, working with UK government to access some of that funding. And each of those projects has a clinical lead, and through those innovation hubs, those regional innovation hub infrastructure that we've talked about, is able to embed that development and testing and prototyping within the clinical environments. So as David mentioned there, the users of a innovation output are not necessarily just the patient outcomes at the end, but the people involved in using it on a day-to-day basis as part of their work in the NHS. And so it's really about kind of embedding those projects in the environments where they'll be future used if we get to the point of adoption, to be able to bring the workforce along with the design element.
Thank you. So the questions are coming in thick and fast now. So I'm going to jump to Chris with 2 questions, because there's 2 in the chat. So the first one was, as you can see, around that kind of learning models, what are your thoughts on that? And then the second one has come from Simon, which is whether you're measuring disclosure risk. Chris, can you answer that for us?
I can, yeah. So the first question, which is about why generate the synthetic data to capture properties, and why not predict the model or predict the outcome of interest directly, as I understand it. And I guess that what I've presented there, particularly with the VAE, is kind of a checkpoint on the way towards a foundation model within the EHR data more widely, and the diabetes data specifically, where we will be able to then train heads on top of the foundation model to directly predict the thing that we're interested in doing, rather than having to generate the synthetic data as an interim step. But it's part of the method, and it's a useful interim step, I think. So that's that question. The other question is about disclosure risk. So yes, I sort of chose not to go into that here, but because that's obviously a large discipline in itself. So this is the risk of disclosing information when you're generating synthetic data. And we are looking at that and looking at ways to implement, but to first assess the risk in a variety of different ways, including sort of adversarial attacks, etc., and then potentially to implement a differential privacy type approach, so that we can give a privacy budget to go along with the release of synthetic data or the use of synthetic data. So that's the arm or the line that we're going down with that. But I didn't touch on it because it's a whole project in itself.
Perfect. So we've got a couple more questions. So first one is from Colin McLean, and this is whether the CSO would be willing to work with organisations such as Cancer Research UK in order to develop a data science training programme. For example, embedding data scientists from academia and industry into an NHS environment for a period of time. Who wants that one?
Yeah, so I suppose I'll start, and I suppose the easy answer is to say yes, Colin. We've kind of done some work with Samantha within CR UK around about where we most effectively collaborate and work together, and clearly bringing data scientists in to understand the NHS data that we have available and to be able to unpick the kind of health informatics piece. I'm sure Chris will also say takes a wee bit of time, but once you've actually developed that expertise, then it can really kind of layer on specific advantage. I think what we're seeing, especially with the kind of cancer mission activity and increasingly deep phenotyping with the genomic data coming in that's now hosted on AWS platforms, that we have a real opportunity to bring those data scientists in to be able to have that deep knowledge of how to link NHS clinical data, real world evidence, with that deep phenotypical data that's often generated through trial activity. So I think that's something I'd be very happy if you just ping me an email to pick up offline. Thank you.
Perfect. And we had one more question, but I see Sean has jumped in and answered that for us. So that was around a bit of a logistics question, just knowing a timeline for potential next round. And Sean's come back and said that hopefully towards the start of early next year, they'll be in a position to move forward with that. So we've got a couple minutes left, so there's probably time for one more question, or if anyone wants to follow up with the speakers based on the answers that they've heard so far. So feel free to just raise your hand and just turn your camera on if you want to ask anything. I think you are safe, speakers, I think. So once again, thank you very much to David, Carrie and Chris for your time. Thank you very much to everyone attending. We really hope that you found that useful. Please feel free to feed back to us if there's anything you would like to see in future. And like we say, we will be sharing this recording and the slides in the next couple of weeks. And finally, a big thanks to Serena and Rachel for organising and getting us all working smoothly today. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again in the future. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Katie.
Thanks all.